Hello, you're watching Talking Europe. In his first 100 days in office, US President Donald Trump has triggered unprecedented turmoil at home and abroad, particularly on international trade, and also by his somewhat awkward rapprochement with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Europe is trying to figure out its place and influence in this fast-changing world order, and France is striving to be at the heart of that European conversation and action. Well, we're pleased to welcome today France's minister-delegate for Europe, Benjamin Haddad. He's held the job since last September. He worked for various top think tanks in the US, and in 2019, he wrote a book called Paradise Lost: Trump's America and the End of European Illusions. Quite a prescient title given what's happening now. He's a member of President Macron's political party Renaissance, and previously he was with the conservative UMP, as it used to be known. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about Donald Trump's plan for Ukraine. What do you think of the concessions that the Ukrainians are going to be expected to make, not just on NATO membership, but also on the territorial concession?
Our position has always been the same. For the last 3 years, Ukrainians have been fighting not only for their freedom and sovereignty against Russian aggression, but also for the security of all Europeans against the threat that Russia represents for all of our democracies, with its interference, with its cyber attacks, sabotage, and its constant threats. This is why Europeans have been, alongside the United States, of course, providing weapons to Ukraine. This is why we've been supporting sanctions against the Russian economy. And the question now is not only to get to a ceasefire, but also to make sure that we have a just and lasting peace that's not just a truce, a break that Russia uses to rearm and reattack Ukraine, which is what happened in the past after the Minsk agreement in 2014, 2015, but a real long-term stability for our continent. This is why we will have to take our responsibility to be able to deter Russia. This means continuing to support the Ukrainian army, a strong, robust Ukrainian army, and the question of security guarantees to which Europeans will participate. But I want just to add a word, because we're talking about long-term prospects and guarantees. But the truth is, if you look at the reality on the ground today, the Ukrainians, more than a month ago, have agreed to the principle of a 30-day truce. In the words of President Zelensky, unconditional. Russia has never responded. Then we had talks about a truce on energy infrastructure and in the Black Sea. And here again, Russia had circumvolutions, asked for a lifting of sanctions, which of course in that context is unacceptable. And we've seen the strikes by Russia continue every day, horrific strikes against civilians, against infrastructure, against the Ukrainian military, and maximalist demands by Russia on demilitarization and neutralization. We Europeans share the objective of the United States, which is to find a solution to end this war and to have a long and lasting peace, which is in the interest of Ukrainians, of Europeans, and of the United States. But now it's up to Russia to make up its mind, because it is continuing to renege on this. It is continuing to not give any serious answer, and it's continuing its aggression on the ground.
So on the security guarantees, which is really a crucial point, how can the EU or European countries provide that when it's so difficult to agree even on this relatively modest reassurance force in Ukraine? How do you get to the next level?
It's of course in our interest to make sure that we can have a long-term peace for Ukraine. And as I said, the first security guarantee is of course to have a strong, robust, independent Ukrainian army that can deter further Russian aggression. And then, as we've discussed with key partners like the United Kingdom and others who are willing to participate in this at the level of Europe, but also other countries maybe outside of Europe, such as Canada and others, we will have to take our responsibility. This could take the form, as President Macron has said, of deployment of contingents in key strategic points of Ukraine. Of course, not fighting forces, not forces on the front line, but reassurance forces, like it is the case today in the Baltic states, in Poland or Romania. In Romania, as you know, France is framework nation within NATO. Once again, to be able to continue our support for Ukraine, to be able to deter further Russian aggression, and to ensure a lasting peace. It's fundamentally in our interest. It's in our interest to have an independent, sovereign Ukraine that can continue, that can rebuild, that can continue its European orientation and to have peace against the threat that Russia poses to all of us.
I'd like to move on to some other matters, particularly the standoff on trade between the US and the EU. Do you think there is going to be a deal within this 90-day pause? Is it likely to happen, in your opinion, in your assessment?
Look, let's put the situation as it is. First, these tariffs are completely unjustified. They have no relation to the trade relationship between Europe and the United States. We talk about a US trade deficit on goods, but it doesn't even include service. We import US services, such as tech services. Number two, they're detrimental to everyone, starting with the US, starting with US companies, starting with US individuals, consumers who are going to face the rise in prices, the inflation that they will provoke. And you can see the stock markets right now in the United States that are dropping because of this turbulence in the world economy. They're going to be detrimental to the US economy because if you're a European or an investor today in the world, are you really going to invest in the United States with the risk that it represents economically, politically? So that's something that you already see in the US. So we don't want a trade war. We don't want protectionism. We've seen the negative impact for everyone of protectionism in our history, if you look at the 1930s, for example. Now, the best way to be able to de-escalate, which is what we want, is to have this negotiation that the European Commission is leading, and we fully support the effort of the negotiators by the European Commission, and to also show that we can react, we can respond. We have the instruments at the European level to be able to defend our interests. The EU is not weak, and President Trump is the first one to say so, actually.
Well, you've got the instruments, but not all EU member states are on board for using, for example, the ACI, the anti-coercion instrument, or for hitting US big tech. I mean, I think France is more open to that than other EU member states.
I've heard the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, be quite upfront about this a few days ago, saying that one of the possibilities would be to tax tech companies, to use the anti-coercion instruments. Once again, it's part of the instruments that the EU has developed these last few years precisely to be able not to be naive on trade matters anymore. This could go from barring access to public markets, from taking specific IP. It's already the case in the United States where you have strong Buy American policies already that were already implemented and amplified under the Biden administration. Once again, what we want is to be able to find a solution that's in the interest of everyone and to be able to de-escalate. Right now, we have a situation where you have 10% tariff on European goods, 25% on steel and aluminum. It's not acceptable. It cannot be accepted as a sort of new normal of the trade relationship. So let's have a negotiation. Let's have a solution that allows us to go back to what was the situation before and trade between the United States and Europe. It's in everyone's interest. But we have instruments, once again, to be able to defend collectively our interest. And I heard this from the President of the European Commission. If you allow me to add a word, beyond just this trade dimension, what's the question that's being asked right now? It's the question of European competitiveness. The best way to react to this is to focus on ourselves, to focus on supporting our innovators, our companies, our SMEs, making sure that the 300 billion euros of European savings that cross the Atlantic every year to fund US stock markets stay in Europe, that they stay in Europe to support the companies in AI, in quantum, in the green transition, in defense that need funding and capital, that want to be able to expand, but too often they still see too many impediments to be able to develop all across Europe because you still have different regulatory standards, because you still have different corporate law systems across European companies. Let's make sure to complete our single market. Let's make sure to be able to have, for example, a 28th regime of corporate law across Europe. This is what Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta have been proposing in their reports, which I think really provide the right roadmap for this, to make sure that we can compete with US companies, with Chinese companies. There's no reason, when you look at all the talent we have, when you look at the capital we have, when you look at the depth of the market that we have, there's no reason for us to not be on the same level as the US and China.
But we now do have European companies threatening to leave the EU. For example, a group of 32 pharmaceutical companies because of the whole situation on tariffs. So if there is no deal, it could actually be very bad for innovation in Europe, couldn't it?
Would they really go to the US once again with the uncertainty over trade, over economics, over politics right now. I think, once again, you have so much opportunity, but let's make sure when we simplify our norms, when we make sure that we have the investment for our companies, where we lift the barriers that we're putting on ourselves at the European level, let's make sure that our companies can find all the opportunities they need at the European level to be fully competitive. This is what we've asked the European Commission. We've seen the competitive compass. Now it's time to act. It's time to accelerate on simplification of our rules, which, let's be honest, are too often an administrative burden on our companies. Let's make sure that we focus on public and private investment at the European level. Mario Draghi says we need 800 billion euros a year of public and private investment in defense and green and tech to be able to catch up with the United States. Over the last 30 years, the US has generated twice as much GDP per capita as the EU because Americans tend to work more, they've invested more, and especially they've invested more in tech, which has allowed them to gain more productivity. So many opportunities for Europe if we make the right decision, if we take this moment as a historical turning point to focus once again on our reform and on our investment. I'm very optimistic about this. You know, there was a poll by the European Council on Foreign Relations recently that asked citizens of the world, do you think the EU can compete with China, India, and the United States? Americans said yes. Chinese said yes. Indians said yes. The only one who said no is Europeans. Let's have a little more confidence in ourselves and look at how the rest of the world is looking at us.
Change in mindset might be needed.
Change in mindset.
Thank you so much, Benjamin Haddad, Minister-delegate for Europe in the French government. Thanks for watching us here on Talking Europe.
Thank you.